It's going to be a little less of an interview, I think, and more of a chat, although I'm lucky enough to have my cheat sheet here. So if I get in trouble, I'll just signal and that'll mean more wine. Honestly. And I'd just like to add to that I think the fact that Hazel's book was shortlisted for the Medical Book Awards is sort of, it's important to note because I think that shows the importance being placed on this fusion of literature and academia to explore issues of sort of wider public interest in the ethics sphere. So I just think that's useful to highlight that. So we'll start, I think, Hazel, maybe with you just telling us a little bit about the storyline, just to give us a little context.
For those people who haven't read it.
Yes, hopefully hopefully you've read it but not bought it yet, and then you'll buy it tonight.
I'm hoping not to give away too much of the plot for those people who haven't read it. Basically, the story starts off with a couple who have been infertile for 14 years, and they're black Nigerians, and the scene is a labour ward where the mum, Candice, is having a twin delivery. And the first baby is born a black Nigerian baby, the spitting image of his dad. The second baby, however, is a little girl, and she's born a little while later, and she is not black Nigerian, she's coffee coloured, which instantly makes you think, what's happened here? This was the result of IVF, and this black Nigerian couple have now got one child who cannot be their biological offspring. The consultant in the fertility centre, who was the lead consultant for this conception, is Justin Leyden Green, who comes in for the delivery, and he instantly knows he has to go into action here. There has to be an inquiry. But there are other things happening in Justin's life, and once an inquiry is underway, he continues to see patients, and almost immediately is confronted with another major dilemma, in that he has a couple in front of him who have a child of 4 who has a rare blood disorder, Diamond-Blackman's anemia, and the parents are asking Justin and his team to help them to have a specific child who will be the same tissue type as the little boy Sebastian who has the anemia, so that this little boy can be given a stem cell transfusion, a very controversial procedure. So Justin has to think, now can the centre cope with something else as controversial as this? In his private life he's also got problems because one of his daughters has now got mixed up with pro-life campaigners, and for somebody who leads a fertility centre, this is not good news. So there are all sorts of things going on, but the story basically centres on these two families who are presenting dilemmas to fertility centre.
And I think, you know, both of those families and the consultant, and throughout the book, one of the big issues that comes up again and again is this issue of the right to privacy, the duty of confidentiality, and you see it as a consultant, you see it through the families, you see it through the clinical team, and I think it's presented in a very sort of approachable, very personal way, which makes it, I think, easier to engage with. And I think you were going to have a reading, perhaps,
yes,
along that maybe shows us how some of those have happened.
This is just a short reading, just to give you a sense of it. Jack opened one eye, only 6:30. Another 30 minutes before the alarm would drag him out of slumber. He drifted gently. You awake? Patsy's whisper reached into the privacy of his dream. I should have told you, sorry, before this, that Jack is a lab technician in the fertility centre, and Patsy happens to be a receptionist in the doctor's surgery where the Nigerian couple are patients. So she's just said to him, you awake? Can I ask you something, hypothetically speaking? A bit early in the morning for hypotheticals, isn't it? Shut up, and you can stop that, Jack Fitzpatrick, right now. I'm serious. Oh, so am I. So am I. I'll get up and that'll be that, she warned, flouncing across to her own side of the bed. Okay, I'm listening. You know about genes and fertilization and everything, right? Well, basically, yeah. Not all the really technical stuff, though. So, can a black woman have a nearly black child? If the dad's white, she could. But if the dad's black too? Jack took his time dissecting each word before he let it escape. Patsy had a habit of quoting him ages after the original conversation. If they aren't black through and through, she could, he said. Maybe if they both have a white relative in a previous generation, something like that. I don't know about the colour genes, if one of them's recessive or not. He dropped his head to kiss the bump in her collarbone where it hadn't set quite straight when she'd fallen out of a tree, a snotty little kid competing for the respect of her much older cousins. She didn't jerk away, so he moved up to her neck. This time she swatted him to the side and he subsided onto his own pillow. They look totally black. I mean, straight out of Africa black. Both of them, she said. He froze. Hey, what's this all about? Thought you said it was hypothetical. Well, one of our doctors, he's got this couple on his list, and they're black Africans, and listen, this is in confidence, right? Right, cross your heart and hope to die. He traced a cross over her heart so swiftly she had no chance to react. These patients in our surgery, they've just had twins, only one's black and one's kind of light brown. I mean, how can that happen? He whistled, he hoped convincingly. No kidding. No kidding. So? Mother been fooling around, maybe, he said, praying for forgiveness. I read somewhere some woman conceived twice at the same time by two different men, playing away as well as at home. She had twins. Nobody would have known, except they were both the spitting image of their dads. Straight up. Scout's honour. Patsy was silent for a long time. He half lifted his head to look at her, but she was lost in thought. I don't think this mum's like that. I mean, they've been doing the whole IVF thing for yonks. So, where have you go to all that trouble? Doesn't mean she's Mother Teresa. Maybe she got fed up waiting. Maybe she's fine herself, fertile I mean. Maybe it's him that's got the problem. Say she secretly has a fling with somebody else, a white bloke, only she gets pregnant by him at the same time the IVF works. She turned slowly. Jack stared into the flecked hazel irises. That possible? I don't know. His eyes slid down to her parted lips, her long neck, the thin blue veins threading down to her breasts. I'm only a jobbing lab technician, not a PhD in genetics. I guess it's possible. She was silent so long that Jack began to suspect she'd dozed off again. He sneaked a sideways glance. No, she was very much awake. When she spoke, it was as if she was trying words out for size. Do you, people like you, I mean, the technicians and everything, do you get to handle the eggs and things and the embryos? Well, nobody actually handles them. Her elbow was sharp in his ribs. You know what I mean. Carrying them on dishes or in syringes or whatever you do. Sometimes. Why? So, could they get muddled up? The technicians? No, idiot, the eggs. I guess it's possible, Jack said, but this stuff is regulated like you wouldn't believe. Everything gets checked and double-checked, everything's charted and labelled and signed for. Can't see a mistake happening. So you'd think it was the mother having a bit on the side? More likely than a lab error, I'd say. Suddenly Jack knew an urge to adopt Catholicism. The need for absolution was visceral. You wouldn't imagine something like that happening, would you? I mean, getting caught out like that, so obvious. It'd teach you never to fool around again, I guess. I feel sorry for the dad. Imagine what he thinks whenever he looks at that kiddie, or when anybody else sees it. You're wasting your talents. You should be writing detective stories instead of being a doctor's receptionist, he said lightly, inching closer. Patsy Graham, the novelist. Sounds nifty, don't you think? Now you are kidding. You're skinny enough to fit onto the jacket flap anyway. For the last time, Jack, I am not skinny. You should hear what my old ma says. Huh, disposed of that threat. He closed his eyes and feigned sleep. After a while, he said casually, what does the doc in your surgery think? About me becoming an author? No idea, I haven't asked him. Touché, he grinned at her. About that coffee kid? How should I know? Doesn't he write things in the notes? Of course, but we don't see it. We have our code of practice too, you know. It's not only your infertility place that has rules and regulations. Yeah, who rattled your cage? Jack propped himself up on one elbow and watched her brow furrow in annoyance. Nobody, and don't be such a moron, I wish I'd never mentioned it. You premenstrual or something? Trust you. And with that, she threw back the duvet, grabbed her clothes and stomped off to the bathroom. Jack watched her pert exit and then lay back down again, slowly, warning flags flapping across his field of vision. Ominous ones.
I think that sort of nicely demonstrates the particular problems faced by people in the hospital, the clinical sort of side of things. Pressures Jack has sort of keeping the peace at home with also, and both of them really, with also the sort of the professional duties. So, you know, how far should he go in dealing with these competing demands, do you think?
How far should Jack go? Well, I think he's got to really worry about the issues for him as a member of the team, but he's also got to worry about how he's going to get on with Patsy. So he's caught between these two competing interests. And because Patsy is involved in the clinic and knows more, then he's treading on eggshell. Because if she eventually finds out he's known about this all along, he's in real trouble. Which is why I've got her as the receptionist in the clinic to make this a hotter issue.
And so word does get out about the twins, and so I mean, there's a reporter involved, and so what sort of obligations or duties do you think the reporter has in this situation while investigating this?
Well, the reporter hears about this in a rather strange way, because she goes into a florist shop and she overhears a delivery man, the florist's delivery man, talking to the florist about this case. She's up in this sort of attic room, so he's calling up to her, which means that when the reporter walks into the shop, she can hear what he's saying. And he's been to the home of this Nigerian couple and seen these twins. So he's just telling her, he's seen these twins, and isn't it odd? And the journalist, obviously, her ears prick up and she thinks, is there a story here? So she hangs around and hears as much as she can. And then she goes to all sorts of lengths in order to find more information. So in order to pick up on that straight away, she buys some flowers, and then she goes out of the shop. She whips around the corner for 10 minutes, then she goes back into the shop and she says to the florist, I've made a big mistake, I've come with the wrong handbag, and I'm going to deliver these flowers to this family, and I haven't got their address, and I've come all this way. And the florist, in all innocence, gives her the address. So she then finds out where they are. The journalist goes to the home of this couple and she tries to get information unsuccessfully. But having got a pointer to this, she then tries to find the story. Now, on one level, you could say, well, fair enough. She's in the business of finding stories. She's also in the business of making a sensational story in order to sell a newspaper, so you can see where she's coming from. But then you have to ask yourself, is it right that she should do these things? She adopts a couple of disguises. She finds out by standing near the woman's home, she finds out that this other person is coming into the home. She overhears their conversation when they're hanging things on the line. She sits in a park in a disguise and hears these two mums talking and gets this information. Is this right? And this is about challenging people to think, where are the boundaries for people who have these competing interests?
And, obviously, I'm not sure if is it the Opakanjas?
Opakanjas, yeah.
They're not the only ones that have these privacy concerns, because the mother that that she's talking to, of course, is has her own sort of privacy concerns, and that brings us sort of to the Zairs, who also have quite a personal dilemma and are caught up in the media side of things as well. And so, at one point, she speaks, the Zaire mother speaks to the media. And so I'm interested in what you think about, once they've spoken publicly, where does that leave their privacy?
Yeah, this is a really tricky one, isn't it? Because initially, when it's just a theoretical possibility, this mum is really keen that people should know about it, because she has this view that if only they understand that we have got a child who's going to die, surely it's okay for us to go for an embryo to save the life of our child. And she feels if she can just put that across in a rational, intelligent way, she will get people on board. But I don't think it's giving away too much of the plot. They do actually get permission to do this, and so she's going through treatment, and eventually is contemplating carrying the child, and suddenly the whole picture changes for her, and she says to her husband, "I can't do this. I can't talk to the press. Not now. This is our children. I don't want people to know where we live. I don't want children to have to answer these difficult questions." So it's not a static thing. It's something that changes, and there's a huge difference between the theoretical possibility and the lived reality for this mum. And you can sympathise. But in a way, she's opened the gates, because once you have said to the press, "Yes, come in, we'll talk to you," you've almost given them permission to pursue you. But should they? This is another question that I leave with the reader to see whether this is actually fair and right.
Right. And I think their situation, actually, they're balancing a lot more rights and interests, perhaps, even than the couple with the twins, because they're contemplating, the right to life for their son, and their interest in keeping him alive, their own right to privacy, and their interest in sort of making decisions about their family without other people's hang-ups or other people's interests sort of impinging on that, and then the right of this unborn child who has no rights until he or she is born alive, but then also trying to figure out what does the future hold for this potential child, and is there a satisfactory balance for all of these and all of these rights to some extent are embodied in the law, so is there a balance that can be?
I don't think, again, that there's one simple answer to this, because I think it changes over time, and I think the only way you can handle it is to continually revisit and review the situation and balance up these rights and interests that are sometimes competing and sometimes not resolvable in a way, because they are still competing. But I don't think you can say this is the right thing to do and stick with it, because the situation changes over time. And you've just said, before the child's born, it has no rights legally. After it's born, there's just that split-second difference. I mean, it's difficult to reconcile, isn't it?
Who do you think should have a say when it comes to balancing the things?
Well, I think that I'm now getting on to my personal opinion on this. You pushed me to this, and this is what I try to avoid in the books. But I think that in a given situation, the family who are closely involved, and I think that hearing what the children say, even though they're young, is also important in all of this. And the parents and those members of the family who are intricately involved with this whole thing, we need to hear what they say. And the clinical team who are looking after them need to have their say. And they bring a wealth of experience and also expertise to the case, because the parents probably have had no experience of anything like this, and they're bringing all the emotional baggage and their particular interests to bear, whereas the clinical team are coming with the benefit of experience in these things. And I also think that Justin is right when he has these layers of committees and people that he consults who then give him the benefit of their opinion. He presents the case to them and they can tell him how they perceive this fits with what the regulations, the law, everything that there is out there says about these kinds of things. But I also think that society, the public, have a right to have a say, but not at the personal level with the family.
And how does the public have their say? Is it through people like Natalie, who's the reporter? Like, is that how they
That's a
have their say?
provocative question. Because obviously the reporters are in the business of presenting things in a different kind of way, particularly the kind of newspaper that Natalie's reporting for. But I think that the answer to that is that there are good avenues for the public to give their opinion. I mean, in the case of newspapers, there's the avenue of replying a letter to the paper about something to present a case if you feel strongly about it. But there are also opportunities for the public to respond to consultation exercises. Just today, we've heard about the, I don't know if I use the expression three-parent families, you know, where they've got these chromosomes that are in the bit round the nucleus, and it's possible to put together that bit with the nucleus and sperm.
From all three.
Yeah, I don't want to make it too complicated, but is that making sense? And this is now really being debated very seriously. The Nuffield Council of Bioethics has produced a report, and the Human Fertilisation and Embryology Authority are looking for people to contribute to that. The Nuffield Council take consultation from a lot of people as well. So there are those kinds of things. So if you feel strongly about these things, you can have a say. And you can also approach your ministers and people. So I think there are all sorts of ways where the public can have an effective voice, but they need to think about the issues sensibly, not just have a kind of knee-jerk reaction to a sensational press item.
Yeah. Well, and that sentiment that you've just expressed there, I think, ties in with something that one of the characters, Dr. Norton, talked about when he was giving his presentation to the news.
Oh, this is Professor Norton,
Professor
who's the
Norton,
professor,
yes.
Professor of Medical Ethics and Law.
Yes.
Yes.
On page 238, and he talks about, you know, the more serious the implication for the family. Would you like to read that paragraph of his? It's at the bottom of 238.
Anxieties in themselves don't justify extensive regulation. The personal preferences of individuals command respect. Serious moral claims require the greatest respect, and if you're going to deny a person what they want in those cases, you would need to have a very weighty reason to justify such a denial. One can't get much more serious than a claim which amounts to saving the life of a beloved child. So the burden of proof lies with society and individuals who would curtail this liberty. These parents have a very, very good reason for choosing this path. There's nothing frivolous or selfish in it.
So do you agree with that sort of approach?
It's interesting that you pick up on this, because I've agonised over this, and when I was writing the book, I had to look at all the different kinds of things that people could possibly think about it. And Professor John Harris in Manchester, who's quite often wheeled out by the press because he's a very colourful character, as you all know, he'd written something on the paper, so I contacted him. I knew him from my days in the Institute of Medical Ethics, and I said to him, you know, you've written this, do you really think it, or is it just one of those things that you've said to be provocative? And he said, yes, I do think it. So we had quite a long discussion about it, and I think I came round to agreeing with him, I think, because although particular cases don't necessarily make good law, do they? And you have to be very careful about that. But I think that in the case of saving the life of a child, indeed you can't get anything much more morally compelling. And it probably is down to society to make a very, very good case to say why that couldn't happen. So I think I am pretty much persuaded that that's so now. But it took quite a bit of persuading.
Yes. Which again, I think, comes back to who speaks for society, which I think is something that we all just sort of still struggle with.
Yes.
But and I think that quote from that character is interesting in that, because he talks about this idea of proportionality basically, and that's a very big concept in the law, in all sorts of different areas of the law. So I think that's maybe why I picked up on it, because it has so many wide ramifications across so many fields. But do you think that part of that approach maybe is facilitated because of the multiple layers of regulation that the doctors and the consultants are subject to, that this makes it sort of more palatable?
Yes, I think so, because you are getting something of society's voice through that medium, aren't you? Yeah.
I really like the way that you introduced the ethics and the ethical oversight and the regulatory oversight throughout the book. There was sort of the specter of the ethical review committee first, and so well, we've got to prepare for the committee. But then the lead embryologist, Scott, who is quite consistently unhappy with sort of the level and the intrusiveness of the Human Fertilization and Embryology Authority's oversight.
It's fair to say he's mighty impatient with them.
Yes. So I guess, what do you think, and of course the HFEA is about setting boundaries, and a lot of what they do is tied up in confidentiality and privacy and ensuring a whole bunch of things. But basically what they do is they set boundaries. So what do you think about, what do you think the boundary issues are for some of these characters?
Well, I think, let's take Scott, the embryologist. He is, first and foremost, in his own mind, he is a researcher. And he's got a very worthwhile cause that he's working towards, because he's looking for a cure for major neurological disorders. And he has a personal interest in this, and he's really a driven man. But he feels as if he's hedged about with restrictions. So, for example, there's the business of not being allowed to do research on embryos beyond 14 days. And his sense is, if only I could just keep them a little bit longer, I could do more. And then there's the business of using animal material as well as human material. It's very, very easy to get animal material. He does his preliminary work on animals, and he wants to just move forward, and he wants to get there, and he sees these people hedging him about with all these restrictions. And in all of these kinds of things, he sees the authorities as just being short-sighted, because he has a vision that takes him beyond all of this. And in his heart, he feels that because he's doing something so worthwhile, he ought to be allowed to loosen this up, and these people just don't understand. And then if you come back to another angle and you look at a patient perspective, I'm thinking of one of the patients that Justin mentions quite briefly. Excuse me, Ashley Turner. She's a girl who, when she was 22, developed cancer. And before she had treatment for it, the team said to her, if you want to have a family, it would be a good idea to either harvest eggs or embryos. And she and her partner Carl decide that they will harvest embryos as the better option of the two. So they create the embryos and they're frozen. So she goes ahead and has the treatment, but as often happens, the treatment itself imposes a lot of strains on their relationship, and he departs. She has the treatment successfully and decides, yes, she does want to have children. So she goes back to the clinic and she says, you know, I'd like these embryos implanted. Hang on a minute, you can't do that. They say, you've got to have permission of your partner. So she goes off to Carl, or she contacts him, and she says, you know, I just need your permission. He's not going to do it. Never in her wildest imaginations did she think he would renege on this. But he's now got another partner, and she's pregnant, and he doesn't have any problems with this, but he doesn't want his children to be brought up by this woman that he's rejected. And she goes through all the appeals that she can. She goes as far as Strasbourg, and at every level she's told, no, it needs the consent of both parents. And you can understand from her point of view, she's running out of options here. And these are her embryos, these are her eggs, and she has in her mind these little babies in the incubator, you know, with pink and blue ribbons and smelling of Johnson powder. You know, she doesn't perceive them as less than a pinprick and just a few cells. She's got this sense that these are her babies, and she's being denied them. And she keeps persisting with Justin, you know, what can we do? And she asks him about cloning and all sorts of things. And of course he says, absolutely no, there's not a consultant in the country who would go down that route. But you know, this poor girl feels, again, in much the same way as Scott, that all of these restrictions are just not right, because from her perspective, they aren't. So I think it is really difficult for people to understand, even though we, when we're looking from outside in, can see the wisdom of having them.
Yes. And there is a case that's gone to Strasbourg on that very issue.
Yes.
I can't remember if it was
I can't remember the name.
McFarlane, Evans, or Blood, or
Sorry?
Natalie Evans.
Evans, yeah.
We've obviously got experts in the audience. This is daunting, isn't it?
So, but now within that, you know, within the sort of the regulatory framework that Scott is working in, there's obviously, you know, there is scope for scientists to push. Because in the book they talked about, well, you know, they couldn't, first they couldn't do IVF, but then they could, then they, you know, now they're pushing to do a pre-genetic diagnosis, and so, you know, there's, and a number of the characters, one of them, I think Jennifer from the ethics committee talks about, you know, where does this end?
Yeah.
Where do we go next?
The slippery slope argument.
Slippery slope. And I'm interested to know, because, you know, as I said, a number of the characters brought it up. And so what do you think about sort of the propriety or the power of those arguments, particularly in the light of the Zairs who are facing sort of a very real, practical now problem?
I once heard the philosopher A.C. Grayling being asked this kind of question about slippery slopes, and he said, well, I can't remember precisely his numbers, but he said, if somebody gives me a carrot, I don't have to go on and eat 83,000 carrots. Implying that if you go to a certain place, you don't necessarily have to go the whole hog. And it's inappropriate, he didn't say this, I'm saying this, I think it's inappropriate to be making a judgment at one point based on the possibility of something extreme happening later. I mean, we don't say we won't give somebody with a heart disease digoxin because somebody else could use it as a lethal poison. So I think if you're taking the analogy of a slippery slope, we don't have to go to the very highest level and face a precipitate drop down to disaster. We can join the slope at a certain point where it's controllable, and I think we have to sometimes rely on the moral integrity of people to observe that. But then people will say, well, look what happened with abortion. But I would say, well, yes, look what did happen with abortion. Why can't we learn from that and make quite sure that we do have safeguards in place so that these things don't develop that kind of momentum?
And again, I guess it comes back to the regulation that exists and how much oversight there is. It influences sort of how far down that slope we actually ever sort of get.
Yes.
Yeah. Another issue that I found quite fascinating in the book was this idea, the nurses who were confronting Justin and saying, again back to the open canvas, you know, you must give this baby to the biological and you raised it in some of your comments already, but this idea that of what it means to have familial sort of ties, and what counts. And I think both families' predicaments sort of raise that issue. But I'd like to sort of hear your thoughts on what you think about the nurses' arguments that, you know, genetics wins.
It's a difficult one, isn't it? But I think both families do illustrate the fact that these treatments do raise questions and present dilemmas. In the case of the Obakanjus, the Nigerian couple, they are the natural parents of one of their children. One of them may be the natural parent of the other one. One of them most certainly isn't. And there are little bits in the story that let you know that things are not as settled as they might be, even when they start to resolve their difficulties. Justin, the consultant, notices that the dad always takes the boy, and the dad's mother, who's a really flamboyant Nigerian lady, Aurora, positively terrifying. And when this child is born, she gives Candice a terrible time. She wants them to get rid of this child. She will then become the grandmama that she was meant to be. And she absolutely refuses to take Destiny anywhere. She won't have anything whatever to do with her. So for her, with the traditions and the culture from which she came, there's a tremendous amount wrapped up in genetic inheritance, and the fact that this might be a white gene that's crept in, a white gamete that's crept in here somewhere is just anathema to her. So there are all sorts of questions for them as a family in dealing with all of that. And even the mother, who has carried this child through pregnancy, she has been breastfeeding her, and she's been bringing her up while this is all being resolved, goes through times of thinking that, well, actually, it might be better for her if she was with another family. She worries about the genes that she personally has inherited from her mother, who had a whole lot of horrible things happening in her life. And Candice, in this experience, sees some of those characteristics coming out in her. And she thinks, well, if my daughter is not actually my daughter, she hasn't inherited those, so she might actually be a nicer person and she'd be better with somebody else. You know, I mean, this is really very powerful stuff for a new mother to deal with, isn't it? And then in the case of the other family, the Zairs, who've got who are having the PGD, they're facing all the questions about a child who is genetically theirs, but is being chosen for a very specific reason, and what will that mean? And even though the mum is quite steadfast in saying she has to do everything she can to save her son's life, she goes through really powerful periods of agonising and wondering if this really is right. And then her husband worries about whether they should be doing it at all, because it's making her into such a wreck. So, you know, there are serious questions to be asked about families whenever you start to tinker in these ways. And
I think it's quite good because it takes some very high level sort of concepts and questions and makes them quite concrete through the experience of these families, and about, you know, for the Zairs, how do we not instrumentalize this child? Are we giving it enough intrinsic sort of value, which I think is one of the sort of ethical questions that really ties into this savior sibling. And you know, would you, as far as the Opakan, would you have that child? Because I mean, they struggle with this question of do we test, do we not?
Do we have to test it? Yeah, exactly.
Would you?
Now you're asking. Would I? And the truthful answer is, I can't say, because we can't. We might think we know, and because I've written this book and I've spent ages researching all the issues and things, I think I have the answer for me. But I can't possibly say what I would do until I'm in that situation, because there's one thing to decide theoretically, there's a whole different ballgame when you're faced with the reality of it. So in the book, they actually do make the decision that I would make. I'm not going to say what it is because it'll spoil it for those people who haven't read it. But I do bring them round to that because I think that's probably the best of all options for their purposes. But it's not an easy decision, and I don't think there is a single right answer.
I think in a lot of cases the decisions that these families were facing were in some ways made more difficult by some of the language that was used. And I think it was Natalie, maybe, the reporter who talked about or wrote about designer babies. And I'm just interested in what you think about, you know, these labels that end up getting used and becoming quite powerful.
Yeah. That particular one, I think, is probably used as a kind of shorthand. And in the cases where people like Natalie use it, I think they're using it in a fairly provocative way. And you can see why, because this is about provoking people to have a reaction. But I personally dislike the term strongly because it smacks of a kind of frivolous, almost whimsical choice, you know, searching for what this person thinks is perfection, so that this individual might say, my designer baby would have blue eyes, fair hair, be musical, have a high IQ, and be absolutely a whiz on a unicycle. You know, that kind of nonsense that really is singularly unimportant. But it shouldn't be used in that way.
And it kind of draws back into this idea that the nurses raised about genetic determinism and how, you know, that we can pick a gene that will allow us to actually make some of these decisions when really we can't.
Yeah.
Well, I've monopolized you for some time now. I speaking about, I guess, being provocative, I don't think you're provocative, but you do give us a lot of things to think about. And for anyone who's interested, Hazel also has a website where she provides questions relating to all of the books. And they can be used as teaching tools, they can be used as just questions around, you know, if you want to sort of think about the stories.
Or for book clubs.
Or for book clubs. So, so her website, which is www.hazelmchaffie.com, for anyone who would like to see that. I'd like to thank you for speaking to me, but now I think we'll open it up to the floor if anyone has questions or comments or anything that they would like to say.
The experts can make comments.
I had one question. I asked it to Ken McLeod as well.
Right.
When you do your research and you think about writing these stories, does the future make you afraid at all, or do you look forward to the future?
I don't think the future per se makes me afraid. I think some of the things that people say and do makes me fear for them. I don't like all of the ways that society is going, but I think I hang on to some kind of hope that the integrity of the whole will prevent us going down too disastrous a road. Because I think there are a lot of safeguards in place, and I think enough mistakes have been made that have made people think carefully about the future, that I like to hope that it will, that sanity will prevail. But having said that, I was exercised this last week because a study was reported in a journal that's called Science Translational Medicine. I can't begin to understand why anybody would give a journal a title like that, but never mind. It reported that the genome of a fetus at 18.5 weeks had been sequenced. I don't know if you saw that.
I saw that.
Yeah, and it said that they had accurately identified a huge number of components, which they had checked after the infant was born, and they said that they could identify 3,500 disorders. And I thought, well, supposing I were a parent and somebody said to me, right, I can tell you that your child is going to have these conditions and is going to have a susceptibility to all of these, what are you going to do about it? I mean, are you going to say to parents, these are the options, are you going to abort these children? I mean, if my parents had been told that when I reached this age I would have 4 potentially very disabling conditions, which I have, would they have said, oh well, we wouldn't want the child about that ours to go through that? I wouldn't have had the life I've had, I wouldn't be as I am now. I can cope with those conditions. You know, I think that kind of future is, I think, quite scary. But I like to hope that there are sufficient people, as we are, to be sane enough to say, now come on. Then you can say, well, okay, one of the conditions that we currently regard as absolutely okay to abort is Down syndrome. I did a study where I talked to nearly 200 doctors and nurses who work with very small sick babies, and I gave them a list of conditions, and I said, you know, which of these would you not treat? And there wasn't a single one who would not treat Downs. It wasn't regarded as not fit to live, and yet it's one of the most common reasons to abort. So then you have to think, well, have we learned from that? Or would we then say that that is okay, so therefore we can have these 3,500 disorders and medical choices? I'm just hanging on to this hope that there are enough sane people to look at it in this kind of way. And it's partly why I write my books, to help people to look at things in the same way and make an informed choice.
An optimist.
You pessimist?
Any other questions, comments?
I have a question. With the Nigerian couple, were there any religious dilemmas for them, perhaps, about whether they should even have had IVF in the first place?
Not for the couple themselves, because that was really the only option they did have. But the amazing mother, Aurora, who was from Nigeria, certainly she didn't know they'd been having IVF, they didn't tell her. And she was making an assumption that the mother, the father of the child, was another man, and it was the mother's fault. And so she said to him, you know, well, I told you you should never marry this girl, and you know, it's all because you've infringed these rules and things, and it's just not the way to behave, and children should be made normally, and you know, we, the Opagandus, always have lovely big black babies, and you know, what have you done to do this? So, yeah. But I do have religious scruples coming in other guises, because there always are in these kind of situations, as you all know. And of all of the problems, religious scruples are one of the hardest to deal with, because when people come in from that angle, you can't use rational arguments to gainsay that particular view.
Great question, Hazel. Obviously the character of Natalie, the journalist in the book, is quite important, and we've seen from recent reports in the Livingston inquiry that journalists are quite prepared to pursue stories that are interesting to the public rather than being in the public interest. It's just a question about, with life sciences progressing as they are and the science and technology becoming increasingly complicated, do you think that journalism is generally equipped to be able to report this in an accurate, meaningful and representative way? And if not, do you think that potentially skews a moral debate about any future direction of life science technology?
I think in some of the good newspapers, yes, they are equipped to deal with this. And I mean, some of the ones that I pick up on, you know, I go back to the original source of some of these things, and you know, very careful work has been done. And sometimes I've known people who've been interviewed, and the journalist in question has picked up on exactly the right things and done it very faithfully and with great integrity. But I think some of the other papers that I'm not allowed to name would come at it from quite a different angle, and you can see the same things distorted with great big headlines that completely skew the picture. And I think, you know, that really is a worry, because there are people who only read those kinds of newspapers and wouldn't dream of going to the original source to check anyway. And you know, and that's again one of the reasons why I write the books, because I want to redress that. And there's far too many people, I think, are taking their cue from the wrong kinds of reporting. Did I answer both bits of your question? Sorry, I can't remember what the second bit was.
Thank you very much. Really enjoyed both the reading and the commentary.
Thank you.
Just kind of to follow up on this last question, and also recalling something that you were saying earlier about the individual or the family opening up to the journalist to talk, and then later changing their mind because now they're living the situation differently, therefore they want to block that access. So this, I would like a few further thoughts of how you thought an individual or a family could be managing situations like that, to use, if you like, the press or the attention to their own benefit, and then managing that process all throughout, even though the circumstances change and now they want to block access. Any lessons learned or tips, your thoughts in terms of, in positive terms as opposed to negative terms, to use the press to our interest, really?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. What actually happens in the book is that when they get to the stage where they're actually having the treatment and this saviour sibling is real, not yet born but real, the mother says to her husband, I couldn't deal with this, there's no way I'm going to go in front of the press and cry in front of them, get all emotional because she's having all this hormone augmentation, so she cries at the drop of a hat and things, and she wouldn't be able to present a dispassionate case. And in any case, this is now real, and she doesn't want that to be for public consumption. He says to her, you don't have to. We will now say we've done our bit and hand this over to the clinic. So if anybody approaches us, we say to them, we're not going to talk to you about this, but you can talk to the clinic about the theory of it. And that's what they do. And I think that's probably the best way of dealing with it, because I think they have a right to privacy, even though they have chosen to be campaigning for the option that they feel is right for them initially. Do you have a suggestion how they could deal with it?
I was more wondering to what extent this, well, right of privacy can be different things, but it's not just the right of privacy, it's the right of telling my own story, being the author of my own story, and to my own ends. So if it's a positive choice to make this information known because it serves my mission, if you like, in the circumstances, then when the circumstances change, then I have the other aspect of my right to stop others, the negative aspect of stopping others to interfere with my personal life. So it depends on how we perceive privacy. That's why I was so
that's a nice construction, and in fact actually that nicely illustrates what happened subsequently, because the story ends with the mum speaking at a conference and giving her story and the children's story. So she's come full circle. She's gone through that bit in the middle where she couldn't do it and it wasn't right for their family, to actually then being in a position to say, right, I can now continue to tell the story because we now have an outcome and this is something I can now talk about.
Just I mean, technologies you describe are universal, but obviously standards of regulation, etc., aren't across the world. I mean, would you have fears of these technologies in countries where there isn't a free press, where there is no regulation, where people can't speak their mind, etc.?
Well, I'm sure that is a problem. Yeah. Do you have experience of that?
No.
Right.
I work for the Scottish governments. We're obviously a very free and open society. Everyone's wondering in many societies, obviously.
But I think it's true in all sorts of ways, though. I mean, the technologies themselves are regulated differently in different countries. Long before saviour siblings were permissible to be created in this country, people who were looking for it, had to go elsewhere, they went to countries where the regulation was more lax, and there are implications in that. It's only since 2004 that this has been allowed in this country. Before that, people had to go abroad, and even now there are very careful rules that apply for those people who can and cannot have these things. So the technologies themselves cause problems internationally.
Yeah, I think the international nature of the science that's applied versus and people's mobility. So you can go to another country. I've done research in Argentina with IVF clinics there, and they're completely unregulated.
Yeah.
Completely unregulated. But what they do is they try to meet the professional standards which are set internationally, so that they can say, look, our work is good and it's ethical and it's just. But we're not regulated on the ground domestically. We're trying to do what we can to meet standards.
And when you look at them from outside, do you feel that they are adequately regulated?
Well, no.
Right.
I think there are good people doing good work, but when there's a complete absence of regulation, particularly on an issue like this, where we in the UK are quite regulated and we feel it's quite right to be regulated, then you can say, yeah, it's all fine when you have various ethical people, but there's always somebody who's not, and then there's no oversight, there's no way to monitor that, no way to respond when someone is doing something they shouldn't do. And it's happened here. People have done things they shouldn't do, but there's been legal responses.
Yeah. It's certainly in the book. This is a problem for the clinicians, that in the past they have had people coming to them for this help, and they've had to say, well, we can't do it, and they know that these people have gone elsewhere, and they're worried enormously. And it's again this question of boundaries that we were talking about earlier. It's a big problem for them if they know that they can't do what's being asked, but the boundaries are perceived as unacceptable to their patients, who then have to go outside those boundaries and incur all sorts of other negative consequences.
And then the boundaries move, and those patients who had to go away come back and say, well, why did you do this for me?
That's right, because now you can do it. And so what was that regulation all about? Why was that boundary set? Because now it doesn't exist.
Perhaps people can have a few drinks and have a chat with you on a more informal kind of basis. It might be a bit more relaxed, and maybe purchase a book or two. And Hazel will be happy to sign the book, I imagine. So
if we could thank Hazel then for coming and speaking to us.
Thank you.
And thank you to Sean as well.